Hi, and welcome to Uncivil Disobedience. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. With me, as always, my co-host and partner in crime, Kennedy Cooper.
Hey, everybody.
And tonight, I'm very happy to introduce from Burn It Down with Kim Brown. Kim Brown.
Good afternoon. Good evening. How
Good
is
evening.
everyone doing today?
Okay, glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on. I certainly appreciate the invitation.
I love the Raekwon poster.
That's the actual album. I have all
album?
albums. Yes, there's a record inside of that frame.
Oh, dang. That's some good stuff to have.
Listen, people come into my house and they just walk around because I have I have a lot of vinyl hanging on my walls, and they just sort of gaze like they're in a like a hip hop museum or like an old black people music museum. So yeah, I've very cool. Well, not just black music actually. You see, Incubus is over my shoulder also.
Gotta
But
rep some Incubus, yeah.
Well, Incubus is 3/5 non-white, so we'll throw Incubus in the black music category. How about that?
Well, being an old white guy myself, I actually have somewhere around here. It's the only piece of vinyl I have, and the only reason I have it is because my stepson got it for me for my birthday when I was still back in Tennessee. But I still have Weird Al Yankovic's "Dare to Be Stupid" around here somewhere.
Now, where did that fall in the Weird Al Yankovic discography? Was that between "I'm Fat" and "Eat It"? I can't remember.
That's around that same time. It's very much 80s and parody of 80s stuff.
I kind of remember that one.
That's the one. Dare to Be Stupid, of course. But that's the one that's got, I think Yoda is on it. And a couple of other obscure things. And I Think I'm a Clone Now, which is a favorite of mine. The other favorite of mine, The Ryer the Kaiser, which is subtitled the theme song to Rocky 15 or something like that, is not on that album, sadly.
Yeah, I just remember when he was parodying Michael Jackson songs, and I'm pretty sure there was a Madonna parody in there also. Didn't he also do a parody of Born in the USA?
Yes.
But I can't remember what it was, though.
He did a parody of everything. I don't remember that one. I remember Straight Outta Linwood.
Was that Linwood, New Jersey? What Linwood would he be referring
No,
to?
Linwood is a reasonably nice, middle class, mostly white, some Jewish neighborhood in Los Angeles.
Ah, okay.
Linwood is the white neighborhood in downtown LA, closest to the parts of Los Angeles where the people who might live in Linwood might occasionally meet black and brown people.
On occasion.
It's not the other side of downtown where you're not ever going to see black or brown people.
Got it.
But it's still middle class, mostly white. Very much the safe neighborhood that people were starting to pretend didn't exist in Los Angeles in the 80s. It's everybody was pretending it was so dangerous in Los Angeles back then, and it's like, I'm still alive. I never once got shot at.
Well, I was watching the Night Stalker, the Richard Ramirez
Netflix,
and I went around the house and reinforced that all my windows were locked, all the doors were locked, because that was terrifying to watch. And even though it was 35 years after the fact, nevertheless, Richard Ramirez still scared me.
Oh,
he's a scary guy. And there's lots of that in Southern California. Orange County is the serial killer capital of the country. Richard Ramirez had committed several murders there. Randy Kraft was in Orange County. The freeway killer was in Orange County. They also all ended up in the same prison in Orange County, which is just the funniest thing, is that all the serial killers ended up in the same prison playing poker together.
Yikes. All getting fan mail by the bushels, I'm certain.
Until the death penalty came back in California and they started one by one executing them.
Has anyone made a movie yet about all the serial killers being in the same prison? Because that seems like that seems like a movie that will probably be on Netflix next year.
Well, it's like it would be the appropriate counterpoint for the poker game with all the murder writers on Castle, where he was playing poker with Michael Connolly, who's the guy who wrote Bosch, which of course was just finished on Amazon Prime, and he was the guy who wrote The Lincoln Lawyer, which Matthew McConaughey did as a movie, and he was the guy who wrote I can't remember the movie now. Clint Eastwood. It was a Clint Eastwood PI movie where Clint Eastwood and Jeff Daniels were looking for a serial killer. And Blood Work. That was the one. Blood Work. And that's also from a Michael Connolly book. So he's been all over Hollywood. And James Patterson was in the poker game. And before he died, Steve Cannell was in the poker game, who did Hunter and the Rockford Files and 10 Speed and Brown Shoe and really great old cop and PI shows. And he died. And when after he died, there was some reason why Castle brought his partner to the poker game, and his partner was going to sit down in a chair. And Michael Connolly is like, no, that's Cannell's chair. Because he's dead now, so you can't sit in the dead guy's chair.
Stephen J. Cannell?
Yes.
He wrote a lot of stuff in Hollywood,
He
right?
wrote a lot of stuff in Hollywood. He also wrote, and this is very prescient now considering what's going on with the current Los Angeles County Sheriff. But he wrote a series of cop novels starring a fictional LAPD murder cop whose partner was former Internal Affairs. And in the second book, he ends up going undercover with an LAPD gang that is copied from a real sheriff's deputies gang.
Whoa.
That was actually run by the sheriff of Los Angeles County, who is in prison now and will probably die in federal prison. And more people need to know that the former sheriff of Los Angeles County will probably die in federal prison for running a street gang made up of deputies that hunted black and brown people while he was actually still sheriff.
Who was this guy? This was in Gates.
This was Lee Baca. Sheriff Lee Baca. He's in prison now.
Interesting.
Linwood comes up in that again because the gang he ran was the Linwood Vikings.
That's right. Knock LA has a very good series. I'm sure you guys have seen it, written by Charisse Castle, who does a very in-depth serial investigative reports on each of the LA Sheriff's Department gangs. And they talk mad shit to her, to Knock LA. When they're trying to get on into the Ask the Sheriff, questions, they always talk shit about Charisse and Knock LA, which means that they've struck a nerve, clearly.
Yes.
So, which is great.
Some of my friends in Los Angeles are part of the People's City Council, which is a cool activist group down there.
Oh, yeah.
And I agree with them. Alex Villanueva still needs to take his shirt off.
Listen, listen, if he didn't have anything to hide, then he would have already shown everyone his
exactly.
Yes.
And the fact that he still hasn't taken his shirt off means that there's got to be tattoos there.
That's right. Yes.
Well, and it's interesting, if a regular person is arrested and you have tattoos, the police will document all of your tattoos and make sure that that's known information. Why do we as the public not have access to some of that same kinds of information for our own safety? Very interesting.
If nothing else, I mean, they've been proving time and time again that the cops are dangerous to the public. I mean, and it's to the point where within the last handful of years, in addition to all the usual stuff, they've also killed a handful of white girls on top of everything else. And I mean, I don't mean to say this, like, if you understand how sort of the structure of white supremacy works, when the cops are killing white girls, things are really out of hand.
Absolutely. There's no question about that, because that means no one's safe. If white women aren't safe out here, then no one is safe.
And it's the most famous, of course, was the first one where they actually convicted a cop of murder. And I still swear that they convicted him of murder in that one because he was a black cop who killed a white girl. That was the one in Minnesota. But there was an even worse one where the
wait, his verdict just got set aside.
Did they set that verdict aside?
Let me double check my verbiage here. But something recently, honestly, in the past 7 to 10 days, just happened with that, where I think either the verdict was set aside or he's getting a new trial. But I think he's getting ready to walk out of jail, if I'm not mistaken. If he's not already out.
And, the goal with all this dragging out the trial dates, having retrials, the goal with all this is to make people forget.
Oh, yeah.
It's to get this stuff to leave the public eye enough that they feel like, they might get a more favorable ruling through. And I mean, that's their only goal. So, make sure if there's a case going on that involves police brutality where you are, make sure that shit stays visible.
I have to admit, if I were a defense lawyer, thank goodness I'm not, but if I were a defense lawyer, I would be going to that guy and offering to represent him for free, because the best defense that he can possibly make is to do something like sue the Minneapolis PD for not protecting him the way they protected the white murderers, because I think there would really be a case there.
So the Minnesota Supreme Court on Wednesday threw out the third-degree murder conviction of former Minneapolis police officer who fatally shot a woman who had called 911 for to report a possible rape behind a house. Mohammed Noor, in its ruling in the case of Mohammed Noor, the Supreme Court also clarified what would constitute third-degree murder or depraved murder, saying that the standard doesn't apply if a defendant's actions are directed at a particular person. I don't quite understand what some of this means, but Noor had his third-degree murder conviction overturned.
That sort of sounds like you can't call it third-degree murder if it was an accident, and that it's an accident because he was there looking for a rapist and he shot the wrong person, or something ridiculous like that. That's how it sounds. Maybe I'm wrong.
It's just too many, exemptions for "oops, my bad" when it comes to cops, right?
It's like
no kidding.
Well, not the worst part. There's so many bad things about it, but now the good news is that Kentucky has a castle law, and because of Kentucky's castle law, they had to let Breonna Taylor's boyfriend go after he shot at the cops. But the bad news is that the Kentucky's castle law didn't stop the cops from killing Breonna Taylor in the first place. But you didn't hear about how Kentucky's castle law prevented them from charging him. Instead, you heard about them dropping the charges as if they were doing him some kind of favor because of the horrible thing that happened. when the simple fact was, under the law in Kentucky, he had every right to shoot, whether we agree with castle laws or not. If they're going to be applied, they should be applied equally to everyone. And it should be publicized.
Well, I think the argument that the police were making is that they announced themselves, right? So they claimed that they had a warrant and they announced themselves, which
but they didn't. It was a no-knock warrant, so of course they didn't announce themselves.
That's right. Exactly. And the fact that Breonna's boyfriend was charged, period, right?
Yes.
Like they actually took the time to give him charges and held him in jail, if I'm not mistaken. Like
they did. They held him in jail, and they did it on purpose to punish him. And the only reason that he was let go without any charges, because again, the state has a castle law that says they can't charge him. But instead of making it public that they couldn't charge him because of the castle law, they acted like they were doing him some kind of favor, which is just sick when you consider we killed the girlfriend in her own home while he was there. We arrested him for trying to defend the household. And now we're acting like we're doing him a favor.
It's not just to harass him in a blanket sense, too. I mean, that part of it does exist because there's discrimination within the police force, but also it's worth noting that the police do this kind of thing a lot because they know that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend has a very strong chance of suing their department for massive damages. And one of the best ways that they can try to mess up that lawsuit is to charge you with a crime, put you in jail, slow down your ability to file charges. In some states, you can't even file charges against the police for certain kinds of actions if you don't do it within very tight windows. And sometimes they will kind of coincidentally keep someone in prison for just a certain number of months, like 18 months, and then, all the charges are gone. And what do you know? That 18 months was their window to report the police for blank, according to X state law.
Yeah, no, that sounds like our cops, though.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, with more people being having more awareness and giving some more critical thought and some scrutiny and some analysis into like what actually do the police do again? All these cries from politicians and even the police themselves about how crime is out of control this past year, violent crime is up, gun violence is up, and it's like, well, in the area in which I live outside of Washington, D.C., in the city of D.C., the mayor has authorized unlimited overtime. And she's done this since maybe like the middle of summer because there was a spate of shootings, some involving children who had been shot and been injured. So she authorized unlimited overtime for Metropolitan Police. And has that made a dent in the crime? I don't think it has. And there's a lot of pushback against this whole defund the police policy suggestion. It's not just a catchy slogan, right? Defund the police is rooted in.
Some people are pretending that police have actually been defunded. They had that silly reallocation bill in New York that made a big show out of taking the school resource officer program away from the NYPD and taking that money away from them and giving that money to the school budget to fund the school resource officer program. So nothing changed. The only difference was now the schools paid for the cops in schools instead of the cops.
Yes.
But they called that defunding the police. And worse, oh my gosh, this is the worst part. People like Bill Bratton and mayoral candidate Eric Adams have said things like crime went up because they defunded the police, which isn't true. And Eric Adams has said things like, well, Bill Bratton is one of the people who I want to advise me on the police.
Jesus.
Exactly. See, I've never lived in New York, but Bill Bratton was also police chief of Los Angeles, and I have lived down there.
So
Bill Bratton.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say Bill Bratton's not a good person, and
terrible person, awful. Like he was overseer of the broken windows policing, right? If I'm not mistaken, in New York City.
He came in right before or after Bernie Kerik. I can't remember the specific details, but yes, he was specifically in charge of actually enforcing that policy and making that transition.
So where I live in the state of Maryland, we have a terrible governor. His name is Larry Hogan. He probably wants to run for president in 2024. He probably thinks he has a good chance of running for president in 2024 as a Republican. He had a big show of a press conference a couple days ago where he announced that the state of Maryland would be, in fact, refunding the police. This is his exact words. We're going to refund the police to the tune of about $150 million. Some of it is going right out to local police jurisdictions, and others are going to be allocated in next year's budget somehow. But he perpetuated this idea as though police had been defunded, like you said, Chris. And I don't believe a single reporter challenged him on it during his announcement. No one said, Mr. Governor, where in the state of Maryland have the police been defunded?
Well, when Bill Bratton and Eric Adams were talking about the cops being defunded, they're doing it on MSNBC, on Morning Joe, in front of Joe Scarborough, in front of a couple of actual reporters.
Oh, shit.
And in front of Al Sharpton.
I think you have Al Sharpton. Actual reporters.
Compared to Joe Scarborough. I mean, he's not a reporter. He's an ex-congressman who has a show.
That's right. And Mika Brzezinski is,
the best part is Al Sharpton is sitting here just sort of nodding along and giving this conversation credence. I mean, there was a time when people would have said, shouldn't Al Sharpton be standing up for us with the cops?
Al Sharpton, also not a journalist, though.
It's true. He's an activist who also has a show on MSNBC.
Yes, he does. Yes,
let's really drill down on this.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a conflict of interest between being a national civil rights leader and being the paid host of a political show on MSNBC owned by Comcast?
I would say so. But I think Al Sharpton is a civil rights leader, very much in the mold of Jesse Jackson, who believes that part of the path to Black liberation comes through Black capitalism. He believes in corporate America making investments into Black America, and I guess piecemeal, like eventually, if we pile all these rocks together, we might actually build a house.
I will speak up. I will speak up in defense of Jesse Jackson here, which is to say, even though I have not always been as left as I am now, I grew up among some very out there people for Southern California. My dad's best friend, who I always sort of think of as my weird uncle, was a communist. He was an old peace and freedom communist from the good old days of Southern California. He had voted for, who was it? He had voted for Eldridge Cleaver for governor of California on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. And Mario Savo for Senate. So, I mean, there's the party for you. Mario Savo and Eldridge Cleaver ran on the party ticket.
Let's go.
But yeah, and he was a communist. His buddies were communists. They had only good things to say about Jesse Jackson, which is funny because I hear Democrats sometimes repeat some things that I know are Republican bullshit. But Democrats believe this in Southern California at the time. But I mean, communists, people who were very, very big on Jesse Jackson. And Jesse Jackson was, I think, the last Democratic primary candidate that anybody in the Communist Party really supported in any sort of big way.
Was that 84? His 84 run?
That was 84.
Mm-hmm.
That was when Bernie supported him, and Bernie was a lot further left then than he is.
That's right. That's
In
right.
In 84, Bernie was still I can never remember, Liberty Union. And the Liberty Union doesn't like Bernie. They think Bernie's the worst kind of sellout now. They think he's moved to the right. They call him a Democrat. They make a big deal out of the fact that all of the Democrats who have tried to run against Bernie in Senate races have done it to his left. And that the Democratic Party has helped Bernie rather than help Democrats running against Bernie to his left, which is important to remember when you hear that people who profess to be Democrats say, well, Bernie's not a real Democrat. Well, Bernie's had more support from the Democratic Party than other Democrats who have tried to run for Senate in Vermont, at least if they were running against him.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets left out sometimes of some of the political discussion. And the reason they did it was because there were people, and I still don't get this myself. I don't get this myself. But there were people in Vermont in like 2006 who had a Bernie Sanders sign and a Bush Cheney sign 2000. That would have been 2004. But they had a Bush Cheney sign and a Bernie Sanders sign in the same yard. And it's just because that was, people liked him. I mean, more than anything else, that's what matters. If people like you, I don't think anybody would have voted for Reagan based on what he did as president, but people voted for him because they liked him.
Just circle back to how this pertained to Jesse Jackson.
Oh, see, we get off topic. But yeah, no, Jesse Jackson was really popular with a lot of the old communists that I knew when I was a kid.
True. At the same time, Jesse, I guess in his political evolution, he does a lot of work trying to increase diversity on the boards of big Silicon Valley companies, and he's absolutely trying to work within the corporate sector.
Course. And I wouldn't say that he wasn't. No, definitely not. But he's somebody who you still won't hear any of those people who are left speak against him, even though he's doing that stuff a lot of the time. I've never heard any of that group who are happy to call Bernie a sellout. I've never heard them call Jesse Jackson a sellout. I find that very interesting.
The only time, let me not say that, not the only, but the most recent time and probably the most vocal time was after the killings of Mike Brown in Ferguson, and Reverend Jackson and Sharpton traveled to Ferguson, and the kids told them go home. No, sorry, y'all. This is not y'all's kind of show out here today. Y'all need to turn back around. We're doing something different.
I do remember that.
Which is fine. Like, all paths to freedom are not going to be on the same path.
It's true.
And a lot of people disagree with Sharpton and Jesse Jackson's tactics. But Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton existed in the same time and place as Kwame Ture and all these other radicals. You know what I mean? Like, they were all around at the same time. They were doing different things in different places. And each, I'm sure, had critique of the other. But at the same time, I don't doubt that the end goal, hopefully, everybody wanted the same thing.
Well, and that's where I was, and that's where we were when we started talking about Jesse Jackson, is that a lot of Sharpton's role on MSNBC sometimes appears to be to endorse things that would never be accepted from the white anchor in that same situation. I think if Joe Scarborough was talking about how black people were basically conservative, and how everybody in a Black Lives Matter protest in New York was coming in from out of town, I think he would have been looked at differently than Al Sharpton saying the same things.
Did Al Sharpton say that?
Oh yeah. Outside agitators. Outside agitators are Al Sharpton's favorite words. He said those exact words repeatedly.
Oh my gosh! Come on, Al Sharpton. You know better than that.
I mean, that's literally George Wallace language. The outside agitators. Right. If Joe Scarborough said outside agitators, people would be throwing rocks at him, and rightfully so.
We would hope. We would hope. Now, Al Sharpton's not wrong when he says that Black people are conservative. He doesn't mean necessarily that they're politically conservative.
No, I understand what you mean.
But yeah, no, he's not wrong about that, because I mean, you'd be surprised at the amount of resistance within the Black community to policy efforts like defund the police. You know what I mean?
There's a lot of resistance towards anything that would be perceived as threatening the position of the people who have gained so far. And protecting the gains that one has already made is important. And I don't want to say that it's not. But there's a certain attitude all throughout America where everybody has this the attitude now, well, I've got to protect what I've got because I don't know how much more it's going to last, how much longer it's going to last. And that's by design to a certain degree. They want us to be insecure and scared. Because if you're insecure and scared, you're also looking over your shoulder at other people and not trusting them. And the more we don't trust each other, the better off the government and the corporations are. This is my conspiracy theory for the night.
I don't know. I think that generally the way that Americans are conditioned, and this is not just Black Americans or white Americans, everybody. Or, but we're conditioned to equate the police with safety. Yes. And in even Black people who understand that in neighborhoods that are over policed, that could be, low income or et cetera, where there's not many resources, where schools are being closed, where there's food deserts and all sorts of other, cascading fuckeries on top of that. Yeah. They believe that the police presence there is enough to deter the crime without being able, I won't say without being able, but without truly examining why the conditions of the neighborhood are the way that they are. And it doesn't have anything to do with how many or few police are present. It has everything to do with people's ability to be able to remain housed, be able to feed themselves, their education level, etc.
One of the fundamental jobs of the television industry is to keep churning out propaganda. Mm-hmm. The cop show has been a staple since the very beginning, all the way back to Dick Tracy on the radio. And of course, I grew up watching reruns of Adam 12 and the ill-conceived 90s new Adam 12, which, well, let's just say that was better off unmade, though it did star John Wayne's grandson. No, John Wayne's youngest son. Sorry. He plays the grandson in Big Jake if you ever want to see him as a kid, and then you watch the new Adam 12 to see him as a grown-up. But a lot and the LAPD is the single most televised and filmed police department in the country, because of course Hollywood is right next door to the LAPD. So there are all these LAPD movies and LAPD TV shows in the course of our history. And of course other cop shows too, but there's lots of LAPD shows. And it turns out it's because the LAPD had its own liaison department with all of the major TV studios and movie studios in Los Angeles. They had technical consultants on all the cop shows who were also often uncredited writers. So the cops were writing the shows for the cop shows, for literal propaganda. Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, started out as one of these technical consultants and press liaisons in the chief of police's office at the LAPD. He was a cop. He was a writer when he was a cop and not a street cop most of the time, but he was still a cop. Some of his TV scripts were written while he was still pulling down his LAPD paycheck, and he only quit being a cop to become a full-time TV writer.
Interesting. Why do I remember seeing some detailed Twitter threads about Gene Roddenberry about his rampant misogyny and racism?
Because, well, there's all sorts of interesting stuff, good and bad, about Gene Roddenberry. The part that is lascivious, doesn't matter whether you think it's good or bad, but it's very lascivious, is that he and Majel Barrett and Nichelle Nichols had a very long time thing going. The three of them. And that connection is one of the reasons that Nichelle Nichols specifically became one of the first very highly featured stars in Black TV. I mean, he and his wife's unicorn, and his wife was having the same treatment in the same show. And it was all this behind the scenes stuff going on.
Oh, wow.
There was all sorts of weird stuff going on with the writers. There was always a hard time writing or adapting for his universe, though the old writers had an easier time of it than the younger writers. But also, he was almost assuredly a communist. A lot of his creative work is directly inspired, almost line for line, from a very obscure branch of Trotskyism that basically says, well, we're going to have a nuclear war, and then aliens are going to teach the survivors how to be communist. And that's the Vulcans saving the humans. Just right there. And so there's all sorts of weird stuff, good and bad. But the bad is he was a cop. He was somebody who was greatly involved in putting propaganda onto people's TVs in Hollywood. That's some of the worst of the bad, actually. It's pretty up there.
And then people wonder why there's this lingering aspect of Star Trek that is like military worship. Well, wonder how that got in there.
Well, the thing about, and what's so complicated about Star Trek is on the one hand, there's very obviously as little government as possible, and there's very obviously as little obvious military presence as possible. And there's very obviously, I'm trying to think of the right way to put this. The best example is the first episode with Harry Mudd. The miners own their own mining colony. There's not somebody telling the miners, you have to give us your crystals, here's your money. The miners can decide whether they want to sell their crystals to the con man or to Starfleet. And Starfleet has to bid against Mudd with the miners, because as good anarcho-syndicalists, they own their own means of production and the fruits of their own labor. And that's why Starfleet and this disreputable con man have to deal with the guys who mine the crystals on equal footing, because they're the only ones whose decision matters. And that episode says something about labor rights that, if you really look at it, is way ahead of its time. And it can be disguised as capitalist. Oh, look, they're bidding. It's capitalist. But if you think about what it really says about the miners and their mine and the way that their colony is run, it's a huge deal.
Is this season 1, episode 1? You're saying I might have to go back and revisit this episode.
That's Mudd's. The name of the episode is Mudd's Women. That's the one where Harry Mudd is bringing the three girls out into space because they're basically mail order brides for the colony. And he's using this drug to make them look hotter than they really are. Except when the guys on the colony actually fall for them at the end, the boss of the colony sees the girl he falls for exactly the way he saw her when she was taking the hotness drug. And so it's apparently just the same. Once you actually love someone, you don't care. Which was also very much ahead of its time in the 60s when everything was about being pretty on TV.
I think Starflix is on Netflix. Star Trek is on Netflix. I'm going to have to seek out this episode specifically and watch it because, watching the reruns of Star Trek in my youth, I was watching them very mindlessly. So I
was just, this is cool. This is cool. It's science fiction and ray guns and aliens. No, because I grew up watching those reruns. The two things we always watched reruns of were Star Trek and MASH. And so, the communist future and the anti-war leaning to communism past. I think that influenced me a lot, I guess. MASH and Star Trek.
MASH just ends with them all going AWOL and joining the communists, right?
What's really interesting is MASH ends on this very complicated, bittersweet note with some people really happy and other people really sad, and some people not really knowing what to do next. And then there is a spinoff called After MASH, which has Colonel Potter and Father Mulcahy and Corporal Klinger working for a VA hospital in Missouri. And in one of the first episodes, they falsify the records. And again, another show ahead of its time. In the very first episode, they falsify the records of a career Army nurse so that nobody knows that she's being treated for VD.
Oh, interesting.
But so it actually ends up even more anti-establishment than the original in some ways, because they're getting to where they're falsifying records and pulling strings and all sorts of stuff going on because you're working you're trying to work around the system, and the VA's never been the least bureaucratic system in the world.
I was always curious. Those 70s and 80s references to VD was very much a catch-all. I never was clear as to what specifically VD was.
It most often meant syphilis.
Syphilis. I see. I would have thought the gonorrhea or chlamydia.
Gonorrhea is pretty common too. It was a catch-all. The three most common were syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia. Those were the three that VD was just sort of a catch-all for. And then you had all the more exotic stuff that was sort of related, but not quite.
So my uncles are of the age of Vietnam. I think a couple of them actually did serve in Vietnam. And again, I'm just talking because we're just kind of on this topic. But my older cousins told me that chlamydia was not present in the United States until the soldiers came back from Vietnam. Now, is that true, or is that just some?
That sounds like this sort of blaming the victims of the war for the soldiers getting sick, sort of thing. Because let's be honest about one thing. While it does work both ways, it is far more common, because of the nature of the biology, for women to catch VD from men. One of the reasons a lot of transmissions are male to male or male to female rather than female to male, though it does happen, is that there are all sorts of little things that happen during penetration that make infection easier. And it's just some of these little things make a woman more vulnerable. So when people talk about soldiers bringing some new strain of VD back from someplace, it's usually not terribly likely. It's far more likely they're importing some new strain of VD over there.
Which I don't doubt. That's why when I said it, I was like, you know what?
Yeah, no.
I've never Googled this myself. I've never independently even bothered to see if this was true because it sounded silly. But I just remember at a younger age being told that. But then I started thinking, I don't know how much the rates of sexually transmitted disease were being tracked in the 70s or during the times of Vietnam. I'm sure
not a huge amount, but I mean,
chlamydia has been known to exist since way before that, but the 70s just happens to be a time when we started to keep track of STIs a little bit more. And so I think that's part of it's that bias of just knowing that it exists was part of it. But then also, I mean, you always have to think with the Vietnam War that you have this complicated situation with soldiers coming back from Vietnam that they did a lot of like reckless things while they were there because they thought they were going to die.
Yes.
And so, Vietnam soldiers had one of the worst rates of heroin addiction of any group in history ever, anywhere, and things like that because they thought they were going to die. Yep. And when they came back to society, the ones who were lucky enough to come back, they had to try to, find ways to rejoin society. And they knew that people weren't going to understand if they say, yeah, the whole time I was there, I was shooting heroin and doing other risky behaviors, and so a lot of stories were made up about what happened in Vietnam and what it was like to sort of cover what it was really like, which is, these people on both sides suffering terribly, and us doing war crimes and atrocities.
Well,
and all kinds of, and the soldiers on the ground just basically seeing all these terrible things and having to try to reconcile it somehow.
Well, and there is a special kind of trauma in being both abused by your government and used by your government as a tool to abuse other people. And I'm not forgiving things that people do, but there's a special trauma in being used as a weapon like that. And if someone retains enough of their humanity, they're going to feel that trauma and try to come to terms with it somehow. And I think that's why you see so many veterans who are leftists is because it's very easy for them to see how the things that traumatized them and made them traumatize other people are made manifest in the capitalism that benefits from all that trauma.
On the flip side, though, there's a lot of vets that are imperialist also, right?
True.
They believe in the manifest destiny of American white man.
It can do enough permanent damage that people become the weapon. I mean, and that becomes their personality. The guy Trump pardoned, the Navy SEAL who apparently did awful things.
Who murdered the civilians?
The murdered the civilians, took the pictures with his victims, all sorts of stuff. And, some people just, they do everything they're supposed to do and more because the military lets them. And there's a license in that. And then there are other people who it confirms all these prejudices as a survival mechanism to be able to go through all of this without feeling horribly guilty. It's easier to be a white supremacist than feel guilty for a lot of white people, I imagine. If you push away that guilt that way and take the easy way out and blame your victims.
Also, we have this really intense propaganda here because you have to think that the United States, we have one of the biggest militaries in the world. And that's not just by, dollars. It's also like we have a lot of soldiers.
Yes,
and
we do.
You have to think like we don't do drafting and we don't do mandatory service. Most countries have some form of draft or mandatory service that they use to keep their armed services stocked with people, with human bodies. And we do not. So what is the alternative? The alternative has been to create extraordinary systems of propaganda to convince people that they want to be the imperialist tool, the weapon of capital. And so that's why I think partially we have so many veterans that are so staunchly into it, because traditionally veterans that actually serve in combat don't tend to come home satisfied with that experience.
It's true.
Historically. People who actually serve in combat tend to come back home from war and go, that sucked.
Yes.
And so the fact that we even have people on the other side of it just goes to show how deeply indoctrinated people get by the propaganda that the military themselves pays for. They pay for some of our big blockbuster films now.
Yes.
And, we need to talk about that more, because you're not just watching, a harmless action movie sometimes. The 300 was paid for military propaganda, for instance. We know that one now. We don't often know these things until well after the fact. But, that movie was used to rile people up to go to Iraq.
Well, Captain Marvel is another great example of military propaganda, where they changed a lot of things in order to be able to go, yay, military. And the Black Panther, where they managed to make a CIA agent one of the good guys. I mean, who would have thunk it? It just, there's a lot of shameless stuff in the movies. It's true.
I mean, the propaganda is definitely one part of it. I think that just the abhorrent capitalist conditions that we have in this country entice people to the military.
There's
because
an incentive system designed to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't afford to go to college, join the military. They'll pay for your education. You don't have health care for your family or for yourself, join the military. You'll have, health care forever, so long as you live, I suppose. So just the way that America is the shithole country, it makes joining the military very appealing to people, because they can literally have some of their basic needs met, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, and if we've reached the point where the prison system and the military are our welfare state. That's what we have, instead of universal child care like they keep promising people. We've got jail. Instead of universal free community college, we've got the military. Instead of universal health care, we've got, prison and the military.
Yep. And believe me, I mean, growing up poor, senior year of high school, me and a lot of my friends all had that conversation of, are we willing to risk our lives and our ethics, knowing that we'll have things like healthcare for life afterwards if it works out? And every poor family, you've got that uncle that went to the military that's doing better than pretty much everybody else. And you're all looking at that like, But then also sometimes that uncle has got scars,
Mm-hmm.
wounds, internal and external, and you know that too. And maybe you've had to see the bad effects of some of that stuff. My grandpa, very abusive because of his time in the military. And you have to kind of try to weigh that, but at the same time, that you're looking at a ticket to something that you may not get any other way.
My grandfather, who I never met, but who influenced my father a great deal. My grandfather was a drunk who either shot himself or died in an accident while cleaning a gun, and that was directly related to his experiences in World War II, whether it was an accident or whether it was on purpose.
No, I had a relative of mine join the service at a young age, and I was distraught, to say the least, because um, of all the suicides that
Mm-hmm.
veterans come back and experience. I was concerned for this person in my family. I'm like, where's the proof that these people are going to take care of you should you survive a deployment to a war zone? I don't see the evidence, and them being Black on top of that, to deal with the ongoing amount of racism and white supremacy that exists in the
Yes.
military. Not only in addition to the rape culture that exists, in the military. I'm like, this is just a shit institution. Like, this is not something that you should be committing your life to.
Yeah,
right?
and when you talk about where's the proof, like, it's worth noting that a lot of people don't get the full benefits for some reason, and a lot of times these reasons are kind of made up or unfair or just blatantly cruel. I had one friend that it worked out for him. He did his time in the Air Force, and now he's getting all the benefits, and he's glad that he did it overall, although it was very hard on him in different ways, because he now has these opportunities that he wouldn't have had any other way. But it's just as easy to be another person that I know that witnessed somebody else committing suicide while they were on deployment, and then ended up dishonorably discharged themselves. And now he's just back to square one. He has none of that mattered. And so they find reasons to take it away from people all the time too.
It doesn't even take a dishonorable discharge. In order to get all your benefits upon leaving active duty, you have to get an honorable discharge. They also have what they call a general discharge. And one of the dirty little secrets of the military is that there are a lot of people who have general discharges instead of honorable discharges who don't get their benefits. And it comes down to what if somebody doesn't like you and you get a bunch of disciplinary marks on your record because someone didn't like you in some cases. It's too bad, but if something else doesn't happen to get rid of those marks on your record, it ends up making a difference when you leave the service.
Well, speaking of the service and the military, I know we wanted to touch on the status of Build Back Better, which of course
we did.
It is funding that pales in comparison to the amount that the Pentagon and the military get. But people are pulling their hair out as if they're asking for a quadrillion amount of dollars in order to improve our infrastructure and our human infrastructure. Things I think are very worthy of being funded. But why is this falling apart?
And let's not even pretend that it wasn't a compromise already. I mean, originally the Progressive Caucus came up with their first installment on the Green New Deal. And that was $10 trillion. And even then, Bernie Sanders was like, and really it should be 16, but we think 10 is a good number.
Yes.
And then Bernie's original bill that he took to the committee, to the budget committee, was 6 million, and they cut it down to 3.5 million. So, I mean, it was already a compromise. No, I'm sorry, trillion. It was already a compromise at 10 trillion. 10 trillion was already bringing it down from 16 trillion. And then 6 trillion in the committee, and then 3.5 trillion out of the committee. And I watch mainstream media because I like to pay attention to when these guys really blow it. And there was a really good blow it moment where Lawrence O'Donnell did his, well, I worked in the Senate and I know how the Senate works. And I can tell that the way this is coming out of committee, you know that Mark Warner has been representing Joe Manchin's views. And if this bill is leaving the committee at $3.5 trillion, that means they really believe in it and that it's going to pass at $3.5 trillion. And it's just now, no, it's not, obviously not a slam dunk, Larry.
Oh, well, Lawrence O'Donnell, since you know how much Congress works, then you know that the Senate really doesn't work then, right?
The Senate's whole job is to make sure the House doesn't work. I mean, that's its whole constitutional purpose.
No, I have no faith in this process, right? I am jaded, very much so, in my middle age about the effectiveness and even willingness of the American Congress, and hell, even the president, to even get even a fraction of these things passed. Like Joe Biden, throughout his tenure as senator, what would frequently side with the Republicans when it comes to negotiating bills exactly like this. So it doesn't shock me at all to see that his plan is falling apart because, like you said, Chris, it was too small to begin with. And the only reason it's at 3.5 trillion, you know, that the Republicans act like this is just some ungodly number, is because that previous infrastructure attempts over the past 25 years have all failed or have been, you know, decimated or just made pretty much invisible. Like there's not been a lot of investment in our infrastructure at all.
Let's go ahead and pay attention to the elephant in the room that almost no one ever talks about. I think every now and then somebody mentions it, but we haven't passed an infrastructure bill since they got rid of earmarks.
And when was that?
That was like back in the 90s.
90s, okay. I'm trying to think of the last infrastructure bill that I can remember.
The last infrastructure bill that I can remember was, I think, under Reagan. Maybe they passed something, but remember, Clinton lost the House. And there were all these tricks that the Democrats and various Republicans kept pulling to keep the Democrats controlling the Senate for a while. But the Democrats lost the House. And so Bill Clinton never had a chance to pass infrastructure, and they got rid of earmarks. But Reagan and HW had both passed bipartisan infrastructure bills. I mean, they weren't big or huge things, but they both passed, you know, bipartisan bills that gave money to airports and roads and bridges. And one of the reasons it worked was because of earmarks. Because whether one likes it or not, earmarks were guaranteed money to somebody's district that meant infrastructure. And when all these earmarks are being put in all these bills, that means we're slipping little bits of infrastructure into all these bills that have nothing to do with infrastructure, like build a bridge in this town or a railway station in this town as part of getting this bill passed. And nope, nothing since earmarks went away. Not just no infrastructure bill, but also no more infrastructure worked into non-infrastructure bills.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kennedy.
No, I was just agreeing. Go ahead.
No, I mean this is what confuses me so much. I mean, I say confused, but I'm not actually confused. But I'm saying I'm confused. I'm confused because I mean, truly, the nation is falling apart all around us, right? I mean, we just cannot compete with our you know, industrialized allies when it comes to things like public transportation, when it comes to, you know, reduction of fossil fuels or using renewable energy. Like we are just literally decades, if not generations behind.
It's also worth noting that some of our friends and allies are deliberately trying to get back to where we are. They privatized the British railways. I mean, terrible things. But no, it's even with things like that, we're still worse off. That's the scary part.
We're still behind. And you know, if it's a war, you know, no one bats an eye at the cost of the spending. The war in Afghanistan has cost at least $2 to $3 trillion. The war in Iraq cost another $2 trillion. The war in Syria, that's another trillion.
Let's not forget the 20 trillion.
Somalia, Yemen, each of those are, you know, tens of billions per year. And that's all of that. Add all that up, and that still doesn't account for the 5.4 trillion that has been vaguely spent separately on the war on terror over the last 20 years. So we're already talking about $10 trillion in wars, and I haven't even mentioned all of the things that the U.S. military is doing.
Got to do the conspiracy theory thing again here. On top of all this, we do not know the CIA's budget. We don't know how much of our money is going to the CIA every year. It's not something that's even shown to us.
Great.
Yes. So hence, you know, you have at least 2 generations. I'm gonna count part of Gen X and the millennials, and Gen Z is coming along. But in the sense that, you know, we have given up on America. We don't give a fuck who wins. I won't say we won't totally give a fuck who wins elections, but the point is, we understand that at the end of the day, it's a rigged game, right? Joe Biden is not doing so different things than Donald Trump will be doing. So people, especially younger voters, would look at that and be like, well, what the fuck? Not to say that Trump wasn't a fascist ogre, absolutely. But when it comes to things that people protested about, like immigration, when it comes to police funding, when it comes to climate, addressing the climate catastrophes, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are in step, or in lockstep, sort of, on those issues. They
are. Well, and let's look at the cops for a moment. Because the cops are an important issue, not just because of defunding the police, but also in a white supremacy sense. There is an old saying from a lot of different parts of the country: cops and Klan go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
There is, I like to say, cops are off-duty Proud Boys. And another thing that I really like to say is, no, the white supremacists are not infiltrating the police force. The police force has always deliberately recruited white supremacists.
That's right. Yes. Thank you very much for using that language. I hate when people say that the white supremacists have infiltrated our police forces. No. You can't infiltrate something that you founded.
And infiltrate a club that advertises and says you're welcome here.
In my opinion, with all due contempt for various white supremacist groups in this country, the most dangerous fascist paramilitary organization in this country is are the police unions.
Yes.
Not even the police departments, but their unions.
Yeah, it's bad.
It's really bad. But I mean, and the cops are the fascists that we have to be scared of. I'm not saying that January 6th wasn't bad. I'm not saying that white supremacists aren't real and dangerous. I'm saying that if we're worried about fascists with the ability to overthrow the government, it's the cops.
All day. And that's everywhere. And
let's not forget that they essentially threatened Bill de Blasio's daughter in front of the entire country.
I forgot about that. I don't.
She was arrested. She was arrested at a Black Lives Matter protest, and the cops basically made it known very publicly that they had arrested her and had her in their custody, and at a time when they were angry at Bill de Blasio in a way that it was absolutely a threat. And I mean, who arrests the mayor's daughter at a protest anyway in a normal city?
Well, because the mayor's daughter was non-white, right?
Well, that's part of it. That's not the only reason. It's also the fact that they hate the mayor. Not necessarily even with any justifiable reason. He's been scared of the cops and submissive to the cops, done everything he could to lick the cops' boots as mayor, despite giving lip service to all sorts of anti-police rhetoric. But let us not forget that the NYPD doesn't even forgive empty rhetoric against them. I mean, David Dinkins was destroyed by the NYPD with most racist slurs ever, and he increased their funding more than any other mayor had. And they still destroyed his career.
Yeah, it doesn't pay to be a black liberal. You never get you never get thanked for it. It's a thankless job. No, yes, David Dinkins and Bill de Blasio. Yeah, Bill de Blasio was very inept against NYPD during his tenure as mayor. And now in New York, I don't even know how New York managed to pull this off. I mean, they're about to get a cop for mayor in Eric Adams, which is
I have to plug someone here. There is a better choice than either the cop, Eric Adams, or the vigilante, Curtis Sliwa, who are both terrible people who no one should vote for. Kathy Rojas is a communist school teacher who works in the public school system in New York City. She is running on the ticket for the Party of Socialism and Liberation. If you live in New York and you don't want to vote for a cop or a vigilante, vote for the teacher. Easy. Okay, that was the perfect chance to get that out and plug it. Thank you.
And there's a lot of races around the country where where there are very good third-party candidates on the ballot. And I hope people aren't discouraged from voting.
Princess Blanding for governor of Virginia.
First and foremost, yes, that race is I can't even say it's tightening. It's pretty much been a tight race for several weeks now between Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin.
And let's be honest. Let's say we had a straight up, totally fair election. In a straight up, totally fair election, who would not choose Princess Blanding over those other two dipshits?
Anyone that's ever heard her speak and heard the things that she's running on.
Anybody that remembers when Terry McAuliffe was governor of Virginia the first time.
But the problem is the Democrats end up in these extremely tight races, and it's framed, especially to black voters, that if you don't turn out, then this whole thing is lost and it's all your fault. And you black voters, now things are going to be harder for black people because black voters did not turn out for the Democrat.
And that whole blaming and shaming game to try to keep voters in line is also what turns people off. Totally. And why so many black voters didn't turn out in certain places in states Hillary Clinton didn't even visit in 2016. And trying to blame and shame people when your candidate couldn't even visit their state and look them in the face in their communities isn't cool.
No, it's ridiculous. I think it's also worth noting that, we talked a little bit about like this defund the police and things going on. And it's not just New York where you've got a cop trying to be the mayor. It seems like a lot of major cities now, there's a cop candidate who's running on a platform. Well, look, we got to get things back under control here. I'm an ex-cop and I know how harsh we need to be.
Our mayor was never a cop before he was mayor, but he's also public safety commissioner, which means he's both mayor and police chief. So our mayor is a cop because he's the police chief.
What did Wheeler do? Wheeler just totally capitulated to the cops in terms of the vaccine mandate.
Wheeler is so I'm going to just say that tear gas Ted Wheeler is as bad or worse than Michael Bloomberg, but you don't hear about it because he's a Democrat in a city everybody thinks is liberal. And sure, Portland is liberal in a lot of ways, but the cops here are not one of them. The cops in Portland are a throwback to when Oregon was a whites-only state. And I'm just going to say it like that. It's the only way you can be honest about it.
So it seems as though the police nationwide are going to get their way about this vaccine mandate thing. Because I'm pretty sure I heard that Wheeler in Portland was not going to enforce the vaccine mandate for police. Police in Chicago are threatening to quit for their looming deadline that's
let them
coming.
quit. That's the whole thing. Is I don't understand why people aren't willing to just let them quit.
I agree.
There's historical evidence that there's nothing to be afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
There are two cases historically of police strikes in New York City. One official police strike under John Lindsay, and one unofficial strike that was really a sick out under Bill de Blasio. And in both of those cases, crime went down. The only crime that went up during the first police strike was that a whole lot of people in New York ran through red lights at top speed because there weren't any cops. But with the exception of running red lights and not paying at meters, because the meter maids were cops too, and therefore also on strike. But with the exception of those two things, crime went down. And because of the way things are now, those didn't go up during the sick out because there are always some cops. But fewer cops on the street, crime went down.
I'm with it. Trust me. I think if the COVID vaccine mandates are a way to reduce the police force numbers, then fine. Like we'll take any reduction that is available to us. But it's just amazing that COVID ended up killing more cops last year than I think than like the most the other.
COVID was the number one killer of police officers last year.
And they don't want to get vaccinated.
Now,
they don't want to wear masks. Well, we'll just let the chips fall where they may.
Let's keep this in perspective too. Previously, the most common killer of police officers was on-duty traffic accidents.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Especially when they're giving traffic citations on the side of the road.
COVID is killing more cops than cops kill themselves. Well, and so that's impressive. Sorry, I had to get in that dig about the on-duty traffic accidents because I think that's really important for people to understand.
Absolutely, because when we hear the lost in the line of duty numbers that the police as part of propaganda, how many officers lost their lives in a given year, it's not explained how most of those officers actually died. It's implied that they were killed in the line of duty, but no, they were usually struck by other vehicles while they got out of their car to try to give someone a speeding ticket or the like.
Or they caused an accident while blowing their siren somewhere. That's very common as officer-caused accidents.
Yeah, but of course they want you to imagine that every cop died holding a baby and shielding it from a drug dealer, and that drug dealer's got 3 AK-47s all at once somehow firing,
So there's a whole TV show called Life, which is based around a semi-true story of how the LAPD thwarted a bank robbery but lost the stolen money. And in Life, it's called the Bank of Los Angeles shootout. It's actually, I can't remember the name of the actual name of the bank, but the shootout really happened. And these cops supposedly killed all of the bank robbers, but the getaway vehicle with all the money in it just disappeared. If you killed all the bank robbers, how did the getaway vehicle disappear?
Was that the shootout with
there
the
was
police?
a baby they had to protect.
I'm wondering if you're talking about the shootout that was very famous where the robbers were all in like head to toe body armor.
Yes.
And everything that the cops were shooting at them was bouncing off. Like these guys were literally walking around.
It's the same one. It's the same one as the bank robbers were extremely well equipped, almost suspiciously so, one might say.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly they accounted for and killed all of the bank robbers. And yet, the getaway vehicle and all the money disappeared. So where did that money go?
Civil asset forfeiture, of course.
The idea of the whole concept, it eventually turns out behind life, is that the LAPD stole it. Or more specifically, the cops there at the shootout stole it. And they've become this whole department within a department in the LAPD that controls promotions through their money and people who are loyal to them because of their money.
What a strange fictional story, Chris. Doesn't sound believable at all.
It must be fiction.
Kim, you were saying earlier, let the cops just get COVID or whatever. I want to take this one step further. I want to say that I am formally in support of that new evangelical nation being formed out of Idaho. Let's just let all the vaccine folks that don't want the vaccine mandate, you can move to the holy land of Idaho, where God's chosen few will I don't care what happens after that, to be honest. But they'll do something there.
The sad thing, though, is that if we did that, we'd be doing exactly what the billionaires want, because they really want us to just not care about the people who are going to die. And it makes me so mad when I think about it like that. And that's
a lot of people misunderstand the Bill Gates quote about vaccines helping with eugenics and exactly how that was going to work. When you're refusing that vaccine and then getting COVID and dying, that's are eugenics. Falling right into the pattern of traps that Bill Gates would love for you to fall into, in terms of, Bill Gates does not, he openly does not want non-white people to have children. He doesn't hide this really. And, there's this whole confusion about this vaccine stuff and what it means and who funds what. And all I can say is follow the money of who makes profits when you don't get the vaccine, because that's also a group of people.
Yeah, no. And this is something I was trying to convince people, because one of the real popular things I've been hearing from some people who consider themselves socialist and that they think there's no answer to is, what do you mean you're against ivermectin? What are you, in the pay of big pharma or something? And it's like, you think that mom and pop pharma make ivermectin? Do you think it's delivered by the pharmacy fairy? Big pharma makes money off of everything in pharma. That's why it's big pharma. There are three kinds of businesses in pharma. The first are little companies that do research and development and either sell patents or even sell themselves as companies to big pharma. The second is big pharma. The third are these little companies who sell generic drugs by buying off-brand pills that big pharma manufactures or has manufactured in the same factories as their brand name pills, just over here on the generic side of the factory. So every phase of the pharmaceutical market, whether it's research and development that eventually gets sold to big pharma, or whether it's the generic pill market, which is basically buying from big pharma, there is no aspect of our pharmaceutical industry that big pharma doesn't make money off of. The way the industry is structured is if big pharma doesn't make a dollar, they make a dime off the dollar someone else is making. And so when people say, well, ivermectin is how you get back at big pharma, it's like, you're not thinking this through.
Not at all. And for people who say, about the vaccines being a boon for big pharma, for Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, I'm like, yeah, they are. And do you know what else is a big boon for big pharma? Insulin. Like, do you understand? Like every single piece of the American disease condition is monetized. Like, so it's not just COVID.
And the reason that big pharma monetizes them like that is because people actually need them to survive.
Exactly.
If people do not actually need them to survive and they don't actually keep people alive, well, your market dries up.
I mean, but that's not the case, though, because people have long needed insulin, have they
That's
not?
true.
Like, and it's only recent, maybe the past, let's say 10 years and some change, that insulin prices have just begun to be outrageous, truly outrageous, because insulin for a long time was relatively cheap, if memory serves.
Well, you can look at the price of insulin around the world and see that something's not right, because in most countries, insulin is cheap. Countries that lean left or right, doesn't even really matter. Most places besides the United States, insulin is relatively cheap. But here, it can cost hundreds of times the price of other countries.
In every other country in the world, the patents are lapsed and generics and it's very affordable because nobody's making lots and lots of money off it. Everybody's making some money off of it, which makes it very profitable for everyone. But nobody's making lots and lots of money off of it, not on the scale of some other things. So you don't pay attention, and then you see that, the vaccine made somebody a billionaire. Well, sure, but if you compare, let's pretend just for a moment that we had a president right now who cared about COVID-19 the way Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower cared about polio. How would history be different already? I mean, for a start, the reason that they're giving such huge freebies to big pharma is they don't know how else to get the vaccine out there except to have big pharma do it for them, which cannot be underestimated enough. Whereas under Truman, the government directly financed Salk. Whether you approve of Salk or not, whether you like Salk's methods or not, the government thought that it was important to invest directly in the guy developing the vaccine without a corporation being in between him and the government. And they thought it was important enough under Eisenhower that they gave people holidays from school and work and had people vaccinated en masse in schools. People were lined up around the corner to get the polio vaccine at schools.
Yep.
It was because the government went out of its way to make sure everybody trusted them, that it was people trusting the polio vaccine was more important to Eisenhower in some ways than overthrowing Guatemala and Iran.
Yeah.
But I feel like obviously the times are much different. The proliferation of media was not necessarily to the extent that what it was. Of course there was television during Truman and Eisenhower newspapers, but not
when Eisenhower was president, though, newspapers and radio had a listenership and readership like nothing that compares to today.
Absolutely. But I feel, though, comparing COVID to polio, for example, like people and children who contracted polio, you could see the physical effects of what polio was doing to them. Whereas people who contract COVID and who get COVID really bad, they go away, right? They're in the hospital, you don't get to see them.
Except in Arkansas, just over this past weekend, a family had to decide between getting all 4 of their sons' limbs amputated because of sepsis related to his COVID or taking him off the ventilator. So it's absolutely doing polio-like or worse things to people. Polio never had the kind of death in a year and in just under 2 years that COVID has. You have to add up lots of years of polio to get to 700,000 deaths.
Yeah. And, when we're talking about who makes profit off of some of this stuff too, when you hear these stories, behind every one of those stories is weeks in the hospital.
Yeah.
Those hospitals are owned by big corporations.
Yes.
That's not different than a pharma billionaire getting your money.
No, it's not.
Having to go on a ventilator, a company makes money off of that. When you go into the hospital, there's big profits to be made in hospitals. And
Obamacare,
it's all going to the same places.
Obamacare was set up to make sure that stayed profitable. And so that's one of the reasons that everybody wants to protect it, because it protects the profitability of the healthcare market. Now, we should wrap up soon, but I do want to get to one last thing, because when we are talking about the Build Back Better Act, one thing that keeps coming up is Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. Now, that's the obvious thing. If you look a little deeper, though, you find that both of them, their biggest cheerleader was Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer actually campaigned for Joe Manchin against Paula Jean Schweringen in 2018. Chuck Schumer picked Kristen Sinema to run in 2020. I'm sorry, in the special election before that, which was 2018 or 2019. Sorry. But the DSCC is picked by Chuck Schumer. They're an extension of him. He went around the country in 2020 asking people like John Hickenlooper and Steve Daines and Amy McGrath and Jamie Harrison to run for the Senate. And the only one who won was Hickenlooper.
Mm-hmm.
And all the others lost. And if they had won, they would have been Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema. They would not have been Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or even Tammy Baldwin. And it's so important to understand the way that these villains in the Senate are chosen by people like Chuck Schumer and before him, Harry Reid. They weren't chosen by accident. Joe Manchin is not there in spite of the rest of the Democratic Party. Elizabeth Warren raised money for him in 2018 when Paula Jean was running against him.
Awful. You hate to see it. That's embarrassing, right? Can you imagine being Liz Warren and having to tell people,
yes,
own up to the fact that you campaigned for Joe Manchin? You, Liz Warren, campaigned for Joe Manchin.
But when Liz Warren or Chuck Schumer blames Joe Manchin for something not getting passed now, think about that.
I mean, he's the foil. He's the intentional foil, right?
They chose him to do what he's doing.
Exactly.
And they want to blame him for doing what they chose him to do. And it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And people
they don't actually dislike him. Because you can, and same with Sinema, you can always see that they're hanging out, that they'll be, on the floor of Congress going, well, look, we're getting held up by these obstructionists. And then 15 minutes later, you snap a photo of them. They're all sitting there drinking mimosas, laughing about it.
Mask off.
Zephyr Teachout.
No masks anywhere. Yeah.
Zephyr Teachout writes this really great piece in The Guardian outlining point for point just how corrupt Joe Biden has been his entire career. And Bernie Sanders throws Zephyr Teachout under the bus for his good friend Joe. His good friend Joe is not corrupt. His good friend Joe is a good guy.
No, he's not. And he's
Of
never
course
been.
He's not. But let's not forget that. So when we say this, even Bernie Sanders is part of that club. Someone as different from him and as opposed to him as Joe Biden, who is sitting here quietly cheering Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema on, because that was him in the Senate.
Yes, it was.
so this, but that's Bernie Sanders' good friend.
Well, that's a shame for Bernie. And you know what? Joe Biden has had a lot of terrible friends, has he not, in the Senate? Some of the most well-known white supremacists are people that Joe Biden happily called his friends, and I'm sure had all kinds of backroom deals.
Strom Thurmond was his best friend.
Yes, and who was the other one from West Virginia? The rail tracker.
So now that is Richard Byrd.
Yes, Byrd. He was another one. Yes, but that was Joe Biden's buddy. Like they were all good friends. Obama spoke at Richard Byrd's funeral. If that makes it,
I hate to give the liberals any credit, but Richard Byrd recanted and apologized and had his big come to Jesus moment with the Democratic Party and the people of West Virginia, in much the same way that George Wallace did after he got shot. Though Richard Byrd didn't have to get shot to do it. It was totally self-serving and political. But he went through the motions in a way that Joe Biden has not done.
I mean, but I suppose, like, who was that for? I mean, that wasn't for the people whose policies, who were actually harmed by his policies.
Of course not.
I mean? That was to rehabilitate him for white liberals. You know what I mean? Black people didn't believe that. Just like I would think most black people don't believe Joe Biden, but because again we were.
But Joe Biden hasn't even cared enough about people to lie to them about this stuff. I mean, he just swaggers by with it and lets it all hang out there, and people just act like they don't see it.
I don't know who these people who act like they don't see it are.
Well,
I can't.
Someone out there, he's president.
Well, I know he is president, right? And he had a lot of help for being president, right? I mean, the Democratic establishment rose up to make sure that Joe Biden was going to be in place for that. Yes. But unfortunately, like I don't know people that actually like Biden. I know people who felt as though they were forced to vote for him because of the opposition to Trump. They just believe that Trump was
this morning on Morning Joe. Now, sadly, it was somebody making a right-wing argument and not the right kind of argument. But somebody on Morning Joe finally told the truth, which is that Biden didn't win, anti-Trump won. And that Biden was going to lose in 2024 and the Democrats were going to lose in 2022 if he didn't do whatever it took to pass the Build Back Better Act, no matter what he had to cut off it. And while I think that's going in the wrong direction, I think that Biden would have a much better chance of winning if he stuffed the Build Back Better Act back towards the $10 trillion.
It'll never get passed, though. I mean, it'll never get passed. But see, Joe Biden already has a bigger problem than that. The fact that he lied to voters, specifically black voters, about the amount of stimulus that they were going to get. And that's not a small thing. You know what I mean? As people are still very much still out here struggling, I am pissed that Joe Biden still owes me $600. You know
I am too. And it's insult to injury that the amount that the IRS is going to be scanning for is exactly $600.
Yeah, that's trash. like again, like the Democrats don't understand, or maybe they do understand how precarious their situation is. Like it really is. Like they're going to have a big problem getting people out to vote in 2022.
I know a lot of people who are convinced that the Democrats lose on purpose.
They have to. It's the only thing that makes sense.
So I have someone else.
Joe Biden probably was shocked when he won. He was like, "What? It actually worked out."
I know someone else. They have run for office themselves. They have had personal contact and personal interaction with a lot of the people that I only commentate on. And so I do have to defer to their personal judgment in some areas. And they swear that people really are well-meaning, but they are absolutely terrified. They are not very smart, and they are completely dependent on these Democratic Party consultants who continually tell them exactly the wrong thing. Now, when I say they're not very smart, my friend is talking about really big political names who we think of as heavyweights. And their dismissal is, and this person's opinion is, they're not very smart. They're terrified of losing more than anything else. And they're totally dependent on these party consultants who feed their feelings of inadequacy about not being very smart and feed their fear of losing for their own benefit. That's why you see this huge tens of $million grift around these losing Senate campaigns, because these consultants are just raking in money from these campaigns, and these campaigns are paying them millions of dollars. And that's where this money that's being raised for these losers is going.
Yeah. So I'll just say this about Joe Biden, and this may end up being my final thought because I do have to keep my bedtime tonight.
Yes,
sorry everyone.
We're gonna wrap
up. I do occasionally speak to the kind of comfortable, generally white liberals that like Joe Biden, that actually think he's like an okay guy, an okay president. No one loves the shit out of him. No, like I haven't met anybody that's like, during the Obama years, you would occasionally meet someone who was like, Obama's the best president of my lifetime, and I'm so glad to be, living in this time under Obama. I've never met anybody that says that about Joe Biden.
Bill Clinton, there was a lot of fawning. A lot of people loved Bill Clinton in the same
Clinton too. I was about to say Clinton too. Yep, same thing. You would meet people that said,
Joe Biden
living under this is the best it could be.
With Joe Biden, even the internet trolls are like, well, Biden wasn't my first choice either.
Yeah, so I rarely meet anyone that loves Joe Biden. Like I haven't met anybody that loves Joe Biden like that at all. But I do occasionally talk to the kind of liberals that think he's an all right guy, an all right president. And here's what I'll say is the one thing that I've found works when talking to those folks is I just keep asking, okay, you didn't like Trump, clearly. So you know that the Republican Party is full of fascists that supported Trump. We all saw it. So why are you okay with Joe Biden making compromises with those folks? And I'll tell you what, I've actually gotten through to some liberals that way because they're not entirely okay with that stuff either. And I think that's the best way we can try to get people to see that Joe Biden, it really is not anything to be happy about. Is that, he is out here making deals with the same people that openly orchestrated the January 6th shenanigans. Even if you are a liberal who is just barely to the left of the Republicans, you should find this alarming.
It is still my concerted opinion that the best thing that ever happened to primary challengers in 2020 was Pelosi being against impeachment. Because lots of progressive primary challengers were able to say they were for impeachment and really get a good burst of energy from these really anti-Trump voters. And the biggest reason that Trump finally got impeached was because a lot of Democrat incumbents were really feeling the heat from their pro-impeachment primary challengers. And it was really just an attempt to diffuse that whole energy And it worked. It worked. It got rid of the impeachment demand by actually doing something and watching it fail and letting people gloat. Yeah, we knew this was a bad idea.
The impeachment was successful. I mean, he was impeached. He just was not removed from office.
Of course. Well, of course.
So I don't know. Like, the problem is that the Democrats have not prepared themselves for Trump 2.0. Now, whether or not that's actually going to be Donald Trump himself or an iteration of what Trump stands for generally, but packaged better, presented better, maybe less not as overt with the racism, maybe presenting the racism in a more smooth, polished way. But Democrats are not ready for that. And conversely, I think that people who would be Democratic voters, but who are so fed up with the party, we need to be preparing ourselves for at least 4 to 6 years of Republican rule. And what's that going to look like for us? Because I think that the Democrats have absconded any sort of good faith or any credibility that they have with people who could be their voters, right? The Democrats keep insisting on trying to claw back the center and claw back, I guess, more moderate sort of conservatives instead of trying to recruit the left, instead of trying to grow the left.
I know I'm going to catch heat for saying this, but I think one of the worst things to happen to the left was Biden winning and us losing Trump to organize around on the left and attract people who otherwise wouldn't have been there for things like Black Lives Matter protests, or here on the West Coast and in New Jersey, anti-ICE protests were pretty big in some places. One of the things that really got people organizing around those issues was Trump. And when Biden became president, people, mostly comfortable white people, stopped showing up for those protests who had always been there before. Some of the first things I saw not long after Biden was elected was first that they were still protesting against the cops in DC, which the mainstream media did not want you to know.
Mm-hmm.
And second, that a lot of the white people who had been protesting with them weren't coming out since Biden was actually announced as the winner.
That's right.
And it stopped. And I believe whether it would have been good or bad for the country for Trump to be president, we would have been able to organize for 4 more years against Trump. And we would have been able to build a strong argument against Trump. And we would have had not allies, I don't want to say allies, but we would have had cohorts to achieve certain goals because Trump was president, who are not our allies in a different circumstance because Biden is president. And who become our enemies because Biden is president, because we are now a threat to Biden instead of a threat to Trump.
Well, I hope going forward, people will forever disavow themselves of the phrase or of the notion that we can, quote, pull someone to the left. We can push Biden to the left.
Kidding.
If pardon my language, if the motherfucker's not already on the left, how about we don't even consider them? How about that's not even somebody that we even entertain as a person to vote for? Because clearly pushing someone to the left is a fantasy. It's something that you hope will happen, but in practice, show me where that has actually happened.
He can't even push him into keeping his own lukewarm promises.
Joe Biden has successfully pulled Bernie and the entire Congressional Progressive Caucus to the right in obvious ways, where people are afraid to advance their own policies and are only willing to support Biden's policies.
Hate to see it.
Biden's most ardent supporters have been the progressives, who should be opposing him, and his most ardent opponents have been these moderates who want to pull him further right, which means him pulling the progressives further right. And it's really getting on my nerves. And on that note, we really need to go. Final thoughts, folks.
Well, my final thought is tomorrow on Burn It Down with Kim Brown, which comes on at 5 o'clock on Tuesdays and Fridays on Burn It Down with Kim Brown, our YouTube channel. Please go over there and subscribe. We're going to take some moments to examine. I'm not going to call it the complicated legacy of Colin Powell, because I don't feel as though his legacy is complicated at all. Colin Powell is a war criminal, period, point blank. But I know that there are sections of Black America that hold him, and in very much the same way that they hold Obama in this reverence of very much the pride in seeing someone be the first Black blank. Okay, but if the first Black blank is just the 1 millionth war criminal, then I'm not very impressed with the first Black anything. If that person is still perpetuating American imperialism, especially in fatal genocidal ways to Black and brown people across the world.
Nobody ever reminds anyone that Colin Powell was Ronald Reagan's national security advisor and therefore directly responsible for a bunch of the worst war crimes of the 1980s.
Well, even his time in Vietnam, during his tours in Vietnam, he was he there for My Lai?
No, he was not there for My Lai, but he was talking about how well the U.S. Army was getting along with the Vietnamese, like literally while My Lai was happening miles away.
So Colin's been running cover for. He
was on his missions. They burned a lot of villages. He was a very pro-massacre guy. He wasn't at My Lai specifically, but burning villages mean massacres happen. And I'm sure there's one that doesn't have a famous name on it.
I'm sure.
And I mean, burning people's homes and making them homeless is violence in a way that burning a police station never will be.
That is facts. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, so Colin Powell, good riddance. Very much the same way. It was Rumsfeld who just passed away. I look at Colin Powell very much in that same vein as Donald Rumsfeld, as the Henry Kissingers, as the worst actors in my lifetime to perpetuate American violence around the world. So I'm going to take it some time out.
Let's not forget the late Poppy Bush.
Which Bobby Bush? Which Bush?
George H.W.
Oh, yes. Terrible. Poppy. Awful. I hate to see his granddaughter's below average mug on the Today Show. It drives me crazy to see Jenna Bush on the Today Show with Hoda. I'm like, you understand her father and grandfather are war criminals. Why is this woman selling me skin cream or telling me how to decorate my home for Halloween? Like, get her out of here.
And also remember, she's the one who had the famous drunk driving incident while her father was president.
Yes. Hey, listen, I'm glad that Jenna Bush did not let any experience in broadcasting deter her from getting a national television job with the Today Show. I mean, I'm so proud of her. She didn't let her lack of any experience stop her from getting a top tier national TV job.
She must have worked
very hard to get in that position.
She was guest hosting a whole bunch for Kathy Lee in order to build up experience before she actually got the job.
I know. And I know that so many people get those kinds of opportunities where you just get to try out for a national television position.
It's no secret. It's no secret that Letterman thought NBC had promised him Johnny Carson's job when Johnny Carson retired, and that he was tremendously pissed when they gave it to Jay Leno instead, because Jay Leno had been guest hosting for Johnny so much anyway that the NBC execs were like, well, the easiest thing to do is just leave Jay Leno in there. We won't lose any audience that way. Everybody's used to Jay.
But you mean David Letterman, longtime broadcaster, right?
Yes.
Who was coming to this potential job with loads and many years of experience.
But remember,
people like that.
At the time, Jay Leno was a comedian whose only experience in talk shows was as Johnny's guest host, whereas David Letterman had been doing the Letterman show after Johnny for years, was expecting to get that job, and was like, the only thing this guy ever did before was guest host for Johnny Carson, do stand-up, and do a bad movie with Pat Morita. Why am I not getting this job? And so I was comparing Jay Leno to Jenna Bush, not David Letterman.
Oh, okay. With Jay Leno, are his parents war criminals?
Probably. That's how you get those jobs, right?
I mean, we do not know
over and over through.
We do not know why. We do not know specifically why Jay Leno was put into the favored position as guest host, except probably that Johnny liked him. Mm-hmm. But that aside, it's really important to understand that Jay Leno's only experience at that time on any talk show was guest hosting for Johnny. And the sole reason for leaving him in place was because they would keep the biggest part of Johnny's audience by going with a host that Johnny's audience was already used to. It was a totally calculating and mercenary decision.
All right. Well, I really have to go to bed.
Yes,
so here's my final thought. Watch Burn It Down with Kim Brown tomorrow.
Yes.
Learn about how Colin Powell sucks ass, because you need to know that information, and there's no greater person to give it to you, in my opinion.
Follow her on Twitter. It's right here.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you both for having me on. I feel like we just sat here and shot the shit for 2 hours. I don't know if we've ever really
Anytime you want to come back and talk about something,
let us know. What we do, yeah.
I will absolutely do that. I certainly appreciate it. I'm jealous you guys are on West Coast time. It's 11:30 here.
We appreciate you making that sacrifice.
Absolutely. You guys enjoy your evening. Good night, everybody. Wonderful to be on. Thank you so much.
Good night, folks. We'll tweet at you.